Hello, and welcome to this week's devlog for my still unnamed RPG game. I'll give it a name eventually. It's a voxel style game attempting to distill exploration and discovery, like in those AAA games, into endorphin-filled 5-minute bursts which fit well onto a mobile device. It's only a few months old and has gone through a few revisions, but I've mostly been working on combat and gameplay systems. But now I want to put one of those systems into practice, which is the character pipeline. Currently we only have one enemy, which is the goblin. Actually, I do think he's pretty cute, but he could do with some friends to hurt the player with. And then I thought, hey, look at all this blue stuff that's supposed to be water. Wouldn't it be cool if I could jam some enemies into it? As of last week, the player can swim in the water, and this provided the perfect opportunity to test my character creation pipeline as well as some of the other gunk that comes along with it. With the decision made that I would add a water-based mob, I set about finding some reference material. But I've got to start somewhere, and I eventually ended up with this. I fiddled around for a bit and eventually had it in my character inspector along with some fantastic animations. It's going to stick out from the water like this, so I can just stick a few tall thin objects there for tentacles. And I know I keep saying this, but I do plan to improve all the art and animations at a later date, so I really didn't spend too long on these models. I do think all of this stuff will be easier once I have more stuff in the game. So I rigged the squid up with the model entries and it can be spawned into the world. Here's an example. By only replacing a single enum value when constructing the player, I get this. It can walk around and animate just like the player, all while only changing a single line of code. And that is why it's better to build systems and allow this stuff to scale. And I'm not even sure that the squids will equip items in the final game, but it's still cool to see them able to do that. But that's just replacing the player. Instead, what I really want to do is have it as its own enemy in the world. This was a bit more complicated as I only had the one enemy previously. The code was well written enough that I didn't have to change too much. So, the main change is that I now have a proper entity definition system. I now define them the same way I do items, as I've decided that this is the best pattern for this stuff. For instance, I can gather all the bits of data in a single place, which makes defining the entities way easier. I have this entity definition now, which allows you to define a load of attributes for an enemy, two of which are very important for water-based entities. The first useful attribute is this bitmask system for traversable terrain. This allows me to specify which type of terrain an entity can traverse, specifically in this case to control movement on the water. In this case, when an entity is about to move somewhere, I first check their terrain movement flags, and then query if their intended position is valid for their settings. In the case of the squid, if their new position after the move happened to be a land tile, the code will just cancel the move altogether, preventing them from leaving the water. The second flag I added is just whether this entity supports the concept of a swim state. The swim state is what allows the swimming animation, as well as the drop in Z position to help sell the effect. Previously, the squid looked like this, as the code was just dropping it down as well as applying the speed damping for being in the water. So this flag just allows you to disable the swimming entirely, making it look as intended, because this is an aquatic animal after all. Now, with all that said, it does still look pretty fishy. Oh, it's a squid, not a fish. I'll be honest, I don't really like the way it looks, but at the same time, I think a lot of this game I don't really like the way it looks yet. Everything is just a constant work in progress, and there are other things I'd like to get it to do, like maybe pop out from the water while the player is swimming in an area. And in all honesty, I might just cut it from the game entirely. Squids in RPG games are quite unimaginative, and really what's important to me is that I'm just building the sort of groundwork for what will come in future. So that's a squid enemy. He's sort of going through some stuff right now. But I'll be honest with you, this wasn't the main thing I spent this week doing. I'm as shocked as you are. I spent most of my time from Monday to Wednesday instead building the groundwork to fix the map issue that I mentioned last week. I was feeding the procedural map data into a shader, which spat out this lovely map. The problem with that was that this shader was written in Metal and did not support cross-platform. I'm using my own engine for this game, as I'm one of those people. So this meant I didn't have one of those cool cross-platform support shader systems like what some of the mainstream engines have. So, what was the solution? Well, it's probably not the best one. I decided that I would generate the texture on the CPU and then just upload it to the GPU just to draw it. This was properly cross-platform and should work splendidly. The problem was that my engine did not support uploading binary data to textures, so bit of a problem. My engine is a long-term project, so I felt like I wanted to get the implementation of this texture streaming to be as stable as I could. I'm using Ogre 3D for graphics, and a scripting language called Squirrel to actually write projects in, like this game. So this meant I had to expose bits of Ogre 3D to my scripting language, So the code to do this in C++ looked mostly like this. You get your texture and then create a staging texture which is responsible for managing Ogre's thread-safe upload of the data to the GPU. You map a region into memory, get the pointer and fill that region with your color values, then unmap the region and upload the data to the texture. There's quite a bit of complexity involved with actually exposing something to Squirrel. Its API is entirely based around this sort of stack approach, so you essentially can stack bits of data up and then you can pop bits of data depending on sort of, how many values are in a function. So I added two objects, which is the staging texture and the texture box object, which is kind of what you write the data into. The staging texture doesn't really do anything in my implementation, but the texture box is what you actually write the values to. So it kind of has this interface to be able to just say like, write me a 32-bit integer please, and it'll go off and do that. And it does perform some sanity checks to make sure you're not going to do anything malicious like upload some garbage data to the CPU or buffer overflows or whatever. So with all that in place, the engine now supports uploading data to textures from the CPU. Hooray! Once I had that implementation in place, I could finally start to use it in the game. It did take quite a bit of fiddling with things ending up looking a bit deep fried, but I eventually got the CPU-based solution working as expected. So the advantage of this was that the map editor finally works on Windows and Linux after a long time of just crashing horribly on them. I was very pleased with that, but there was also this problem that it wasn't anywhere near as fast as I thought it would be. From jamming some timers in to profile this thing, I found it was averaging about 0.12 seconds to generate the image for a small map size of 200 by 200 voxels. So that sort of alarmed me a bit, but luckily there is some potential to improve it. The main one being that what I have at the moment is really just there to also facilitate the editor tool. The one that's in the game is kind of going to be different. So that's what it takes to add something to the engine. It is a bit of a long windy road, so I hope you can enjoy my coding struggles. Leave a like under this video. Now let's do a quick fire round of some of the other things I sifted through this week. Firstly, the build in Windows is now fixed. Hooray. I was dealing with some painful build issues relating to building OpenAL soft, which is responsible for providing sound. Turns out, and I'm not quite sure why I hadn't solved this before, but you have to put this nonsense before the header files get included in order for it not to break itself. Regardless, the Windows build works, so rejoice for the 95% of the gaming population that actually uses it. Here's a few other small things. I've now got a description of which entity is currently being targeted in the exploration stats screen. That option now also includes a button to cancel the target if you want to do that. Two other small bug fixes. I've improved the Z order positioning for billboards, so certain billboards have priority, specifically the ones that are buttons. It used to be that the health bars would just glitch on top of it, which is a bit annoying. And secondly, I do perform some actual checks when you're placing flags in the world now. So previously it used to be that if you pressed one of the buttons in desktop mode, then it would just spam out and put a flag there when it really shouldn't have. But when I came to actually add that cancel button for the targeting, I just thought, oh my god, this is awful, and I really have to fix this issue. One other thing I'd like to quickly mention, as I realised that I forgot to mention it last week, was that I am experiencing some issues with the Vulkan render system relating to the way that Cleavage UI operates. This is specifically to do with the way I'm doing my compositor passes. It's a bit complicated actually, and I had a bit of back and forth with the main dev for Ogre 3D relating to this. We did come up with a few workarounds, but ultimately they were proved unfruitful because various reasons, and the takeaway seems to be that when the next version of Ogre is released, that problem will be fixed in that, but there's no real convenient way to fix this issue right now. So that is a real shame because no Vulkan. Sad face. I am now counting down the weeks until the end of the year, which is roughly the time when I said I'd be able to make a build of this game public. Lovely. Well, that's it for this week, fellas. Anyway, I'd like to point out that I know I normally bang my head on the desk at the end of each video, and last week I forgot to do that. I'm very sorry, people. So, as a result of that, I will, as punishment, bang my head on the desk right now. See you next week.